Even if someone was doing a psyop and or a long-term setup, and they thought they were authorized, even up to and including the level of the president of the United States, then that doesn't change the fact that there were people that still experienced it at the time, and that was actually what it turns out later, at least, an outlay for very substantial matters. At the end of December, there was an announcement that there was going to be an immigrant passata in the city of Chicago, specifically in a response to understanding that there was an effort to do these periodic sweeps that they did on places where undocumented immigrants lived. This had happened in 2008 and 2009. It was part of the campaign, actually, that was going on in 2008 and 9, where these sweeps of these raids on places where undocumented immigrants were, and or there would be a campaign of arrest that would detain immigrants and take them to jail or take them to the detention center. And so it was understood in the community of faith, communities of faith in Chicago, at least those that were of the Christian denominations, that there was going to be a specific passata, including that was organized primarily by the Catholic Church, but not exclusively, that was going to address matters related to these anticipated sweeps. And this is around the time that the Anglican Church and the Episcopal Church had a very significant political disagreement. I cannot emphasize how profound it was. The the Anglican Church broke communion with the Episcopal Church because of the relationship of women and gays as clerics and the positioning of women and gays as clerics and as deacons. This happened in late December of 2015 or early January of 2016, and in some ways it was huge. On one dimension, it was absolutely huge, but it was happening around that time. And the ironic thing was the primary financial resources were within the largesses of the Anglican Orthodoxy, as well as the Catholic Orthodoxy. And the parish I was working with was having this confrontation with itself that had happened in 2008 and 9 as well, where it was primarily composed of people who had a background in Catholicism from south of the U.S.-Mexico border, but the Anglican Church was doing this sort of recruitment where it was reaching out to parishes that were primarily first language Spanish speaking and comprised of immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, under the auspices that there was some sort of specific faith calling in order to address, the immigrant. And so this was going on again in 2015 and 16. But there had been this call for this special posada downtown, and the padre I was working with had been requested to participate. And then the morning of the posada, they called him and said, "You know what? Don't worry, don't come down." And he was kind of confused about. It was as if he had been disinvited. And we didn't end up going to that one. There was other activities that were ongoing at the time. And the understanding was that the first week of January, they were planning to do these sweeps. And it had been understood, the community knew and was prepared, was trying to take action. There were a number of press conferences that were had at the actual parish that I was at. I didn't personally say anything, but I would talk to people and work with people. We had lots of conversations, and there were press conferences there. And there was an action, two actions, one in Aurora, and then one in the northern suburbs of Chicago, that there were detention centers, and there were different kinds of detention centers. There was one specifically in Aurora, which was like the major detention center, and then there was one in the northern suburbs of Chicago. And those were attended by the press. They were very well attended by the press. They were on the news in both English and Spanish. There were formal documentation. There's formal documents. There's formal presentations that were submitted to the press. And the Padre was online. His he had a Facebook account. And somewhere on the Padre's Facebook account was me in front of the congressional office for Luis Gutierrez, presenting what I had written in a press release. And I had written it in English. But my understanding is what happened is it got translated into Spanish, and it ended up getting printed in Spanish in some publications. And I remember the Padre said he submitted it, and they published it in his I don't know if they said he published it in his name or in the name of the congregation, but I didn't write it in Spanish. I wrote it in English, and he translated it into Spanish. But when it came time to give the press conference, I just expected to participate in the press conference, and we had this formal statement, and it was written out. It was written out formally, and the understanding was we were going to present this statement to Congressman Gutierrez's through his office as a sort of kind of challenge to what the priorities were and why he was doing this. And he was not in town; he was in D.C. And they asked me if I would go take it in, and I did. And then when I came back out, there was to be a reading, or actually before. There was to be a reading it. I thought the Padre was going to read it or somebody else was. He was like, no, you read it. You wrote it, you read it. So I read the statement, and there was actual film. There was actually a film crew there, and it recorded me reading the statement. And excerpts of that I think ended up getting on the broadcast news, but the entirety of the speech, or rather of the pronouncement, was put on film. And for a while it was on the Facebook page for the parish. The actual, and he tried to show it to me, and I didn't want to see it. I was kind of embarrassed. I was like, oh man, I don't want to see it, because I hadn't heard my voice before doing something like that, and I knew what it felt like. And I've always had this thing, I don't like pictures, I don't like video. Until this COVID shit started, I didn't want video at all. But I remember I heard it, and it was terrifying. It was terrifying to hear what I was saying. And there was things like this that were happening, including that's around the time they ended up actually busting Chapo in Mexico. And these events are not unrelated. But what happened was, in one of the aspects, when I was writing this, I said, we will not forget about, and I referenced the appropriations that we had found in 2008 and 9 during the election, specific to the airport technology. The border policy and the changes in the technology that were a part originally of a rider that was on the DREAM Act, but then I contend were actually apparent in my initial review of DoD appropriations in 2008 that were set to take effect in 2009. And I mentioned that was like the second to last thing that was mentioned in the statement. Where is that video? You know, if you do a web search for me, if you do an internet search for me, you don't see me anywhere. And right now, there's no information on the website. See, the ironic thing is, the day we were at Gutierrez's office in Chicago, he was in Washington, D.C., giving a floor speech in support of Obama's gun commission. And then the next day, then he gave some floor speech about immigrants and about immigrants' rights and about these detentions and these sweeps of immigrants. Well, the problem is that what we ended up finding out in our review is that the raids had been planned in August the year before, that there had actually been a formal process and meeting that was talking about Homeland Security and operations related to Homeland Security. And there was actually a determination that had been made in August of 2015 that there was going to be some kind of sweep, or there was going to be some sort of intense or increased activity in January 2016. Now, nobody at the time talked about the correlation specifically with the gun commission and the immigrants, but there was a sort of undercurrent of the concept, the whole Fast and Furious thing that had happened before. I didn't have a real understanding of what that could mean. I was more concerned about the technology. I was concerned it was something more akin to what had happened with E-Verify. And with E-Verify coming up again, because E-Verify in 2008 and 9, the whole process with E-Verify was terrifying. Not just because of the fear that employers were going to turn people in, but that there were things going on with the E-Verify process that some people didn't have they didn't have a lexicon for understanding it, but there was all kinds of other things that were going on spiritually that were being impacted. And later, review has proven that there was all kinds of stuff going on with the intersection of Homeland Security and alleged technology. And so when you're having law enforcement claim that they're having all of these problems with confirming the identity of people, and then you're also having your electronic accounts mysteriously disappear, things just end up getting mixed up. And then you see, like what I saw and tried to point out to other people, where there were these outlays for alleged technology, especially concerning the borders or the ports port system or the border and system and these specific kinds of technology upgrades, there was very significant concern I had. And I was trying to bring that up with other people. So that's what I was concerned was happening in 2015 to 16. And the people I was with understood it that way too. I mean, it wasn't like they had the same kind of bearing I did in terms of understanding it that way. But here's the other thing. There were a number of lawyers that worked with that congregation, including a lawyer presumably associated with the people who took my information after I started getting trafficked through the shelters. They've been hustling all of these deals for a very long time. All of the information that was readily accessible at the time, that was a part of serious crime that was going on and serious threats that were confronting the community, it's all been rewritten. It's completely factually incorrect. And so, that specifically, there was no discussion amongst anybody I was around that what was going on at the time had anything to do with healthcare. This wasn't about healthcare. They were not talking about healthcare reconciliation at the beginning of 2016. Those were not the major issues that were being discussed, even congressionally. Did I go to the congressional website? Well, yes, I did. I went to Luis Gutierrez's website. I went to the website of the people that were the actual representatives in the city, as well as the city council. So all of this backdating and all of this back writing is completely incorrect, right? Did you do another round where you just disappeared the community? And maybe you left a couple people there and they're supposed to be what? Another round of being indoctrinated and too scared and too scandalized to acknowledge what happened? See, that week, it was a really sick thing. And I contend that there was some sort of high ceremonial shit going on in another level. I believe that it's possible that somebody put a lien on Gutierrez's wife, and that's how she ended up dying, okay? But if he doesn't say anything about that, I'm not going to accord him some sort of special sympathy, especially in light of all the other fucking crimes he was committing. And that week, while we were there on site, they had a sweep that day, and they were rounding up immigrants and putting them into detention centers. It had been known about for at least a week, if not 2 weeks before it actually happened. And they just weren't going to stop it. And they waited until after it happened, and the day it happened, they were laying down some major, major benchmarks on that whole thing with Obama's gun commission. The next day, he was talking about what it meant to be on the floor, or it was on the floor talking about immigrants' rights. But later that week, what was he doing? When the only healthcare thing that came up was Gutierrez at a dinner with Planned Parenthood. Do you know how completely detestable it is that you're supposed to be the vanguard of the immigrants' rights community, and the major day that people are being rounded up and processed, you're at a fucking abortion lobby group? That's what he did. That's what he did. And the ironic thing is, a lot of the communities that were organizing were communities of faith, where the whole context around abortion and around family planning services was very different than what is allowed to now be represented as civil rights. He went to an abortion lobby group meeting when everybody else was being rounded up and detained. Now, if this is one of those things where abortionists are a part of some sort of domestic terrorist organization and they co-conspired to put a lien on your wife so that, I don't know, she could be flipped to an Iranian mathematician who was an absolute genius a year later, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's actually what happened. But in the meantime, how many other people got their lives completely trashed and completely decimated without him saying anything? You see, this conspiracy of silence, it ends up in the long term biting your ass. Because the truth of the matter is, there could possibly be a just cause claim for prosecuting the intentionally orchestrated or occult murder of his wife. But it's like, how many other women were supposed to be murdered before anybody got to understanding what it was that gave them the leverage to put that lien on her to begin with? Or, was it one of those things where he thought he was the bald eagle and she was just the first round? And now that she died, and it's a very sad thing, and he's healed from the trauma of his first wife's death, he gets to go start a second family in the good old Masonic boy tradition, right? And see, that's the shit that got Obed fucking taken down when he did. That's the shit. The kind of shit that 10 years later sees your wife knocked off, you hooking up a bunch of teleabortion deals in, advance. So a couple years later, you see, I think maybe I screwed it up because I'm not dead, right? I think I had just enough credit that if they liquidated me at the right time, well, then they'd get those returns. But so why is all of the information incorrect right now? Because that misrepresentation and mischaracterization of what was going on domestically has global implications. Why? Because that shit on Azerbaijan is not accurate. That shit on, and excuse me, am I incorrect? Did they not just have a military conflict that resulted in tons of casualties last year? Yes, they did. Right? So let me ask you, when Kerry went to Azerbaijan to bitch down Azerbaijan because they had made these deals around geothermal, and somebody else wanted Azerbaijan to focus on natural gas, because if they focus on natural gas, that would redefine what the acceptable relationships for Azerbaijan to have were. And somebody wanted them to be prioritizing other strategic partnerships. So the whole situation that was starting to build up in terms of strategic partnerships around geothermal got completely recapitulated. And within a couple of months, there were some things that happened, some very serious things that happened internationally when it came to the energy sector. And so these different things that were supposed to be taken care of and attended to that would have allowed for a particular kind of energy calibration, well, those people ended up getting bitched down, right? And then all of a sudden you have that conversation. Well, I mean, you want to get in the game? I mean, we're looking for diversification. Maybe you can get in what? Distribution? Now that we've been involved with deregulation, we're going to deal with distribution. You mean like how you're going to cut off all the water so the fucking fields go fallow and nobody can get a job doing anything except, processing paperwork for people getting detained? Yeah, right? You mean that kind of distribution? Hold them for a while, charge them some storage fees, make sure you attenuate the rate and figure out like what they consume when. And then once you've been able to get the data, maybe you could put them on a schedule. And if they meet their benchmarks, maybe you'll distribute this at this particular rate, or maybe you'll distribute this at this particular rate. I mean, how long does it take to beta test that until you actually get Congress to pass a piece of legislation to say, you know what, we're going to do an alternative data information acquisition process for the next 10 years. And if we like it better, we'll make it public. And if we don't, then we won't, which is what they did in 2019, right? But before you got to 2019, you already had 10 years left over. Actually, by that time, yeah, you already had 10 years left over from that first year of the Obama administration, completely re-engineering the political landscape. And so nobody talked about those technology upgrades. Because if you had talked about those technology upgrades that were pending in the fall of 2008, COVID-19 would never have fucking happen. You would never have been able to activate a pre-engineered biopathogen using those specific airport scanners at those specific airports at that specific time. And I know. In order to get to that, you'd have to actually acknowledge the detention of undocumented immigrants that were rounded up for a specific process of human trafficking. And you'd have to actually identify how, despite the fact that other people are already dealing with their own problems, including their problems around, legacies of genocide and xenophobia and quotas regarding somebody else's concept of an acceptable pension system, you'd have to deal with that and how that actually impacts people in other parts of the world. Because then you're going to have to deal with, well, that was just an outlay itself on plasma weapons. And how about all those guys on the streets for years getting their goddamn fucking blood stripped down to nothing because you wanted to clean up the junk, right? I'm sorry, I went off on a tangent. Where is the video? Where is the video recording of me delivering in person with a group of people in Chicago, Illinois in early 2016, that indictment to Luis Gutierrez? Where is it? It's not intelligence. You can't ex post facto say something like that's intelligence. That was in the public realm. That was public information. That was political capital. That's not yours. Where is it?